When my daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You'll never be Dad again," something inside me collapsed. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just walked away with 1,000 unsent letters, each one holding the words she refused to hear. For years, she believed I had abandoned her. And for years, I let her believe it, because the truth was more complicated and far more painful. 8 years later, fate decided to intervene in the most unexpected way. Her boss, a man she respected more than anyone, walked into her office with a portrait in his hands. My portrait. A painting of her as a little girl, bundled in my arms the day she was born. And with it came a cascade of questions she could no longer ignore. She thought my absence meant indifference. She thought my silence meant guilt. But every stroke of that painting held the truth, that I had been there all along, quietly, invisibly, watching from the shadows. She didn't know that the letters she never received had been intercepted. She didn't know that the gifts she returned had never truly reached her hands. What happened next was not a tearful reunion. It was a slow unraveling of lies, a painful climb back from years of silence. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just about forgiveness. It's about what happens when love survives even the longest exile. I was 63 when the letter arrived, folded neatly into an envelope so light I almost didn't feel its weight. By then, my days were quiet, too quiet. I spent mornings painting in the studio attached to my modest Vermont home, afternoons walking along the lake where I used to take Clara when she was little. Back then, she was the center of my world. After Marlene passed away, I poured everything I had into raising her. I learned to braid hair badly, to pack lunches that were sometimes more art than nutrition, to sit in the front row at every recital, even if it meant leaving work early. I wasn't perfect, but I was there. And then Lucas appeared. He was charming in that slick, polished way that makes people uneasy without quite knowing why. At first, I wanted to believe he cared about Clara. She needed a maternal figure, someone to help her navigate those years when grief turned sharp and teenage years turned cruel. But slowly, I started to notice how conversation shifted. Lucas had a talent for planting doubts like seeds. He'd say things like, "Clara's been disappointed you couldn't make her practice," even when I'd missed it because of a late-night grading session. Harmless on the surface, poisonous over time. Clara grew distant. At first, it was just shorter phone calls, less laughter. Then it was missed dinners when she came home from college. Polite excuses that felt rehearsed. She told me she understood my work was demanding, but her eyes said something else. "You're not here." The breaking point came at her graduation from Boston University. I'd driven all night after my last day of classes just to be there. The ceremony went perfectly. She crossed the stage, accepted her diploma, and smiled for the camera. I thought we were going to dinner afterward, just the two of us. But when I showed up at the restaurant, they were gone. Lucas met me outside, leaning against his car, with that infuriatingly calm expression. "Oh, you didn't get the message? Clara thought you were too busy. We went ahead without you." I knew he was lying, but I also knew that arguing would only make me look desperate. So I drove home alone, the taste of celebration gone bitter in my mouth. A week later, the letter came. The handwriting was Clara's, careful, almost formal. "Walter, you have been many things in my life, but you have not been a father. I can't keep pretending otherwise. You'll never be Dad again." I read it once, twice, 10 times. My hands trembled, but I didn't tear it up. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. It wasn't the first letter she'd written me, but it was the first one that ended everything. What I didn't notice at the time, what my mind was too clouded to see, was the faint indentation of another hand on the back of the page. A few words written in ink that wasn't quite the same shade. I wouldn't recognize Lucas's handwriting until years later. I didn't call Clara. I didn't write back. What could I say that she would believe? She'd already made up her mind. After that, the distance became absolute. Holidays passed in silence. Birthdays went unacknowledged. I sent gifts that came back marked "Return to Sender." I told myself I was respecting her wishes, but the truth was simpler. I didn't know how to reach her anymore. At night, I would sit in my studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases, and think about how love can turn into a ghost. You feel it everywhere, but you can't touch it. I kept painting, not because I thought she'd see my work, but because it was the only way I knew how to keep her alive in my world. And somewhere deep down, a small, stubborn part of me held on to the belief that one day she'd understand. That one day she'd see the truth. But for now, all I had was the letter and the silence that followed. After Clara's letter, the years blurred together in a haze of quiet routines and unspoken words. I still lived in the same house in Vermont, the one with the porch swing she used to sit on during summer breaks. The swing stayed still now, the sound of her laughter replaced by the creak of wood in the wind. Every birthday, I sent a gift. Sometimes it was a book she'd once mentioned loving. Sometimes a piece of jewelry with a small note. From Dad. Every Christmas, I sent a card. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple wish for her happiness. None of them reached her. At first, I thought she was simply ignoring them. Then one winter, I received my own box back in the mail, my handwriting intact, a red stamp across the top. Return to sender. Address incorrect. I checked the address 3 times. It wasn't wrong. Over the next few years, more packages came back. Some with the same stamp, others unopened entirely. It didn't make sense until much later, when I learned that Lucas had been intercepting my mail, making sure nothing I sent ever reached her hands. At the time, I just thought she didn't want anything from me. And I respected that. Or at least I told myself I did. But the worst part wasn't the packages. It was the events I wasn't there for. Her wedding. I found out through a former colleague who saw the announcement online. The birth of her daughter. I learned about it from a mutual friend's offhand remark at the grocery store. I told myself I was doing the right thing by staying away, by not showing up where I wasn't wanted. But deep down, it felt like I was vanishing piece by piece, erased from every chapter of her life. Then, one afternoon, I saw her on a screen. I'd been flipping through television channels when I caught an interview on a local Boston station. It was about women in leadership, and there she was, my Clara, confident, poised, speaking with a voice that carried more steel than I remembered. And then the interviewer asked a question that knocked the air out of me. Your success story is incredible. What's the most important lesson you learned growing up? She didn't hesitate. That you can't rely on anyone, she said, not even your own father. I sat there, frozen. Hearing her say those words on camera, knowing thousands of people were watching, cut deeper than any letter could. For a moment, I thought about packing away my brushes, my paints, my hope, just letting go completely. But grief has a strange way of transforming into something else. And for me, it became art. That night, I took out an old canvas. I began painting Clara, not as she was now, distant and unreachable, but as I remembered her. A little girl in a yellow raincoat on the first day of school. A teenager asleep on the couch with textbooks scattered around her. A child sitting by the lake with Marlene's scarf wrapped around her shoulders. I painted until my fingers ached, until the images on the canvas matched the memories in my mind. I didn't sign them with my full name, just W.H. Small letters in the corner, like a whisper. I didn't paint them for fame or for money. I painted them because it was the only way I knew how to keep being her father, even if she never knew. A local gallery owner saw my work one day when he visited a friend's studio. He asked if I'd be willing to show a few pieces. I agreed, more out of curiosity than ambition. Weeks later, a few of them sold. Not for much, but enough to make me realize someone out there saw value in the way I saw the world. I had no idea then that those paintings, my quiet confessions, would one day find their way back to her. And when they did, everything would change. I never expected Child of Light to leave my studio. It started as a private project, 13 paintings, each one a frozen moment from Clara's childhood. The first was her birth, the light in her tiny eyes as she rested in Marlene's arms. The last was the day she left for college, suitcase in hand, her back turned toward the doorway. Every brushstroke was a memory, a confession, a promise I could no longer say out loud. I displayed them quietly at the gallery under my initials, W.H. A few pieces had sold before, but nothing like this. Within a week of the opening, a man walked in, tall, impeccably dressed, the kind of presence that makes curators pay attention. He studied each painting carefully, spending nearly 15 minutes in front of the piece where Clara sat in a field of wildflowers, a smear of blue paint on her cheek. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I'll take all of them." I tried to hide my surprise. "All?" "Yes," he said, pulling out a sleek leather checkbook. "These belong somewhere. Important." I thought maybe he was buying them for a private collection, or perhaps a museum. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned where important really was. He was the CEO of Winslow and Hartwell, the very firm where Clara had risen to a senior position. And he planned to hang the paintings in the executive lobby. When the gallery owner told me, I froze. My first thought was irrational hope. Maybe this was fate, an unplanned bridge between us. Maybe Clara would see the paintings, recognize my hand, and understand that I had never stopped being there. But life doesn't work like the paintings you create. In art, you can control the lines. In life, people see what they want to see. The paintings arrived at Winslow and Hartwell on a rainy Thursday. I wasn't there, of course, but I imagined the moment. Gallery workers carrying in canvases wrapped in brown paper, unhooking old decor, replacing it with fragments of my memories. From what I later learned, Clara passed through the lobby that morning in a hurry, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. She didn't notice at first, not until her assistant called her attention to the painting by the elevators. She stopped cold. It was the wildflower piece, the one with her at 7 years old, sunlight caught in her hair. She moved to the next canvas, and the next. Birthday parties, a trip to the lake, a Christmas morning where her hair was tangled and her smile unguarded. Recognition spread slowly, like ink through water. Her face stiffened. She didn't see love, She didn't see longing. She saw intrusion. By the time she reached the final painting, the college departure scene, her cheeks were flushed, not with sentiment, but with anger. Later that afternoon, she marched into her boss's office. "I need to know," she demanded, "where these paintings came from." Her boss, a man named Bennett, seemed genuinely puzzled. "They're from a gallery in Vermont. Extraordinary work, aren't they? The artist, W.H., captures emotion in a way I haven't seen in years." Clara's jaw tightened. "That's my childhood in those paintings, my face, my life. And that artist," she paused, the name heavy on her tongue, "is my father." Bennett leaned back, intrigued. "Your father? Well, that's remarkable. He must care deeply to paint with that kind of detail." But Clara didn't hear admiration. She heard manipulation. She left his office with her thoughts in chaos. To her, this wasn't a reunion. It was a performance, a staged spectacle in her workplace, meant to draw her in or embarrass her. The next day, she stood before the paintings again, her arms crossed. She didn't notice the subtlety of the brushwork, the way each detail was crafted from memory. She didn't think about the nights I'd spent painting by lamplight. All she saw was a man she believed had been absent, now putting her life on display. Later that week, I received an email from the gallery. It wasn't from Clara. It was from a law firm representing Winslow and Hartwell. The message was short. "Mr. Hensley, it has come to our attention that your artwork depicts identifiable likenesses of Ms. Clara Hensley without her consent. Please refrain from any further use of her image in public displays." I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in my hand. My first instinct was to laugh, bitterly. My second was to fold it carefully and place it in the same drawer where I kept her letter from years ago. The gallery owner called me the next day, apologetic. "Don't take it personally," he said. "She's upset, but people often react strongly before they understand." Also, I wanted to believe that. But as far as I could tell, Clara's anger wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the deep, unwavering belief that I had turned her life into a commodity. The public might have seen Child of Light as art. Clara saw it as exploitation. And in that moment, the bridge I thought might form between us collapsed before it could even take shape. Bennett was not the kind of man to let a mystery go unanswered. He had built his company by noticing patterns others missed, by digging into details no one else thought mattered. And when he hung my paintings in the lobby of Winslow and Hartwell, he noticed something odd. Tiny details hidden in the work. One afternoon, Clara stopped by his office to discuss a project. She was more composed than during their last conversation, but her eyes still carried the storm of seeing her childhood laid bare on corporate walls. Bennett gestured toward the painting of the lake. "That scar," he said casually, pointing at the figure of young Clara. "The one on your knee. How did you get that?" Clara frowned. "I fell off my bike when I was 8. How do you know about that?" Bennett leaned back. "Because it's in the painting. Barely noticeable, but there. That kind of detail doesn't come from photographs. It comes from someone who was there." For a moment, Clara said nothing. She had assumed the paintings were drawn from public images, old family pictures Lucas might have kept, or even things from social media. But the scar wasn't in any photo. It was a memory, one only her father could hold. Bennett studied her reaction carefully. "You said your father wasn't there for you, but this..." He gestured to the collection on the wall. "This looks like someone who never stopped watching." Clara left his office that day unsettled. On the elevator ride down, she found herself replaying moments from her childhood, memories she had packed away long ago. She remembered her father running beside her on that bike, calling out for her to keep her balance. She remembered the fall, the sting of gravel in her skin, his hands trembling slightly as he patched her up with a Band-Aid from his wallet. It didn't match the image she'd been carrying for years. That evening, Clara went home and opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside were old letters, mementos, fragments of a relationship she had convinced herself was broken beyond repair. She pulled out the letter she had sent after graduation, the one that ended with, "You'll never be dad again." She unfolded it slowly, reading her own words. They felt foreign now, as if written by someone else. As she turned the page over, something caught her eye. Faint indentations on the back, barely visible, in a different shade of ink. Words written in a hand she recognized immediately. Lucas's. The lines were short, almost instructions. "Be firm, he won't change. This is for the best." Her breath caught. She began pulling out more envelopes, examining the returns from her father's gifts. Most were unopened. A few had strange markings on them, postal stamps that didn't quite look official. And then, at the bottom of the box, she found an old card addressed to her from years ago. The handwriting was her father's. The seal had been broken, but the card was never given to her. Her mind began stitching together pieces she had never wanted to examine. Lucas had been there every time she pulled away from her father. He had always been the one to relay disappointments and absences. He had controlled the flow of information, the access to letters, the interpretation of events. She remembered the night of her graduation dinner, when Lucas told her her father had chosen work over her. She had never questioned it. Why would she? But now she wondered if her father had even known about the dinner at all. The realization was a gut punch. It wasn't just that her father might not have been as absent as she believed. It was that she had spent years building a wall of resentment brick by brick, each one handed to her by someone she trusted. Clara sat back, staring at the letter in her hand. The anger she felt now was different. It wasn't directed at her father. It was at herself for not seeing sooner, and at Lucas for making sure she wouldn't. That night, she called Bennett. "You said something about the paintings," she began, her voice steady but low. "That they couldn't have been painted without being there." "That's right," Bennett said. "They're not just art, Clara. They're records. Every detail feels lived in." She hesitated, then asked, "Did he ever talk about me?" Bennett was quiet for a moment. "No, but every painting talked about you. If you really want to know the truth, you may have to ask him yourself." Clara hung up without responding. She wasn't ready. Not yet, but she couldn't shake the weight of the discoveries. She opened her laptop and began searching for WH. The gallery came up first. There was her father's work, listed under the pseudonym, the collection now noted as sold to Winslow and Hartwell. There were no interviews, no public appearances, just the paintings. For the first time in years, she didn't see absence. She saw presence, quiet, patient, enduring. But beneath that realization was something darker. All the years she had been manipulated, the milestones she had spent in anger, the words she could never take back. Her chest felt heavy. She closed the laptop and sat in silence, the scar on her knee suddenly aching as if it remembered too. The call from the gallery came on an overcast afternoon. I was adjusting the lighting over a newly framed piece when the owner's voice reached me, calm as always. "Walter, we've had a request. Someone wants to visit the installation before we open to the public tomorrow. I thought I should let you know. They specifically asked if you'd be there." I hesitated, a faint tremor settling in my hands. "Who?" There was a pause, the kind that carries both care and warning. "Your daughter." I nearly dropped the phone. I told myself not to read into it. Maybe she wanted to confront me about the paintings again. Maybe she wanted me to take them down. There was no way to know. All I knew was that she was coming. The next morning, I arrived early. I set the canvases in order, checked the spacing, adjusted the lights until each piece stood in its own quiet dignity. My breath felt heavier than usual. The door opened softly. I turned, half expecting the confident, poised woman I'd seen in interviews. Instead, Clara stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning the room like she was walking into a memory. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Her gaze traveled from painting to painting. The raincoat, the lake, the college doorway. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a series of waves she didn't want to let show. When she finally reached the center of the room, she stopped in front of the wildflower field. I stood a few feet away, silent, watching her watch herself at 7 years old. Minutes passed, and then she crossed the space between us. I braced myself for questions, for accusations, for the sharp edge of a voice I hadn't heard in years. But she didn't say a word. She simply placed her hand on my shoulder, a light touch that carried more weight than any argument could. I didn't turn. I didn't want to break whatever fragile truce had settled over us. I just said, softly, "I've always been here, Clara." The words hung in the air, fragile, almost afraid to land. She didn't respond. After a moment, her hand slipped away, and she left without another word. The gallery felt different after she was gone, quieter somehow, though it had already been silent. I stayed until closing, pretending to work, but mostly standing in the spaces she had occupied, replaying the moment like a painting I couldn't quite finish. That night, I didn't expect anything. But as I sat at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unfamiliar number. "If you're free, dinner tomorrow?" There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct was disbelief. Was this a mistake? A joke? But no. The words were hers, simple, careful, and yet carrying an undercurrent I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't forgiveness. I knew that. Forgiveness doesn't come in a single gesture. But it was something else. An opening. I typed a reply, my fingers pausing over the keys before settling on the safest truth I could offer. "I'll be there." The next day, I found myself wondering what it would be like. Would there be awkward silences? Would she speak at all? I didn't expect warmth, but I hoped for civility. I told myself not to hope for more. That evening, as I stood outside her home, I could see shadows moving inside. For a moment, I almost turned back, but then the door opened. She stood there, not in the corporate armor I'd seen in interviews, but in a simple sweater. Behind her, I heard the faint sound of a child's laughter. Her eyes met mine. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "Come in, Dad." The word caught me off guard. Inside, the table was set simply. A small hand appeared from behind her legs, my granddaughter, peeking at me with cautious curiosity. She couldn't have been more than 6. Clara's voice was calm, almost careful. "This is your grandfather." The child studied me for a moment before stepping forward and wrapping her arms around my waist. It was an embrace without history, without baggage. I looked up at Clara. She wasn't smiling, but there was a light in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. Dinner was quiet, but it wasn't strained. We spoke in fragments, safe topics, small stories. There were pauses, but they weren't hostile. When the meal ended, Clara walked me to the door. For a moment, we stood there, the air thick with things unsaid. She didn't offer an apology, and I didn't ask for one. But as I stepped outside, she said softly, almost too low to hear, "Thanks for coming." It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't closure. But it was a beginning. Dinner at Clara's house was unlike any table I'd sat at in years. There was no ceremony, no fine china, no polished silverware, just the hum of a small kitchen, the clatter of plates, and the smell of roasted chicken. Her daughter, my granddaughter, sat across from me, swinging her legs as she talked about school. She didn't know the history between her mother and me. To her, I was simply Grandpa Walter, a title that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. I answered her questions about painting, about whether I could draw her a unicorn, while Clara listened quietly, her eyes fixed on me in a way that felt like she was seeing me for the first time. When dinner ended, Clara rose to clear the table. "Come into the living room," she said. "There's something I want to show you." I followed her, unsure of what to expect. The moment I stepped in, my breath caught. Above the mantel, framed carefully and lit by the warm glow of a nearby lamp, was a painting I hadn't seen in years. The one I painted the night after Clara was born, her swaddled in Marlene's arms, her tiny face turned toward the light. It was the first in the Child of Light series. I had never intended to sell it. I thought it was lost when I left it in storage after Marlene's things were packed away. Clara noticed the way I froze. "I found it a few weeks ago," she said softly, "in a box I'd never opened before." Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. She had opened more than just a box. I stepped closer, my fingers hovering just short of the frame. The sight of it here, in her home, was something I hadn't dared imagine. "This was always yours," I said quietly. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The act of placing it here, in this room, said more than any words could. Over the next few weeks, I found myself visiting more often. Not every day, not even every week, but enough that the house began to feel less like foreign ground. One Saturday morning, I brought over a small set of paints for my granddaughter. She had been begging me to teach her how to draw like the pictures at Mommy's work. We sat up at the kitchen table, brushes and water cups scattered around us. Her first attempts were messy, her colors wild, but her laughter filled the room the way Clara's used to. Clara stood in the doorway, watching. I could feel her gaze, but I didn't look up. There was something fragile about the moment, something I didn't want to break. As the lesson went on, my granddaughter grew more focused. Her small hands gripped the brush carefully as I guided her strokes. She looked up at me with a grin that made my chest ache in the best possible way. When she ran off to show her mother the finished piece, Clara stepped forward. She looked at the painting, simple, uneven, but full of joy, and then at me. Her expression softened. "I was wrong," she said quietly, almost like she was speaking to herself, "about everything." I didn't say anything. Sometimes, silence is the only response that honors the weight of words. She took a breath, her voice catching slightly. Thank you for never giving up, even when I made it impossible. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Clara had never been one for grand gestures. Instead, she reached for the small painting her daughter had made and set it next to the one above the mantel. The two paintings, one from the day she was born, one from this moment, sat side by side, years apart, but connected. I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, exactly. More like the opening of a door that had been sealed for decades. That evening, as I left the house, Clara walked me to the door. The sky was streaked with the soft colors of sunset, the kind I'd always wanted to capture on canvas but never quite managed. She stood there for a long moment, then said in a voice just above a whisper, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I turned to look at her. She met my eyes without flinching. Thank you, I said. It wasn't the end of the story. Healing doesn't happen in a single dinner or a single conversation. But as I walked to my car, I felt the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The bridge between us was no longer in ruins. It wasn't rebuilt entirely, but it was strong enough to cross. And this time, I knew neither of us would let it fall again.